Joining humans in war showed me what true terror means. The war against the Dominion of Scarth had been going on for 30 cycles when the Galactic Council finally admitted that they were losing. And Krelvax remembered that day very clearly because it was the first time he had seen fear in the eyes of the High Commanders. The Scarth were a species built for conquest and nothing else. Their bodies covered in natural armor, their claws capable of tearing through metal, and their minds focused only on expansion and domination. And every species in the coalition had thrown everything they had at the enemy. But it was never enough. Rolav served as a combat liaison officer for the Velthri Collective, one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. And his people had been fighting the Scarth longer than most. Watching their colonies fall one by one, their fleets diminish with each engagement, their hope fade with each passing cycle, the council met in the great chamber of Endara, stationed to discuss what everyone already knew but no one wanted to say out loud. That the war was lost, that surrender was the only option remaining, that billions more would die, but at least some might survive under Scarth rule. Then the transmission came through. A fleet of unknown vessels had appeared at the edge of the system, their designs unlike anything in the galactic database. Blocky and angular ships covered in what looked like additional armor plates welded onto their hulls. And they were broadcasting on all frequencies. Asking for permission to approach the council was confused because no new species had made contact in over a century, and certainly none had ever arrived with a military fleet during an active war zone. But they granted permission because curiosity overcame caution. Krelvavs was present when the human delegation came aboard the station, and he would never forget his first impression of the strange beings that would change everything. They were small by galactic standards, standing barely taller than the average Velthri, with soft skin that had no natural protection, no claws or fangs or venom glands, no obvious weapons built into their biology. And Krelvax remembered thinking that these creatures looked like prey animals, the kind of species that should have been conquered long ago rather than achieving spaceflight. The human ambassador was a female named Lucy Morrison, with yellow hair pulled back from her face and blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with quiet calculation. And she spoke to the council with a calm that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. "We have been monitoring your conflict from the edges of this region of space," she said through her translation device, "and we have come to offer our assistance in your fight against the Scarth Dominion." The council members exchanged confused looks because this made no sense. Why would a species with no stake in the war volunteer to fight? What could they possibly hope to gain? And the Velthri High Commander asked these questions directly. Ambassador Morrison smiled, and it was a strange expression that Krelvax did not know how to interpret. "We have our reasons," she said simply. "But the short answer is that we do not like bullies. And from what we have observed, the Scarth are the worst kind of bullies. The kind that prey on those weaker than themselves and call it natural order." Standing beside her was a male called Admiral Daniel Cooper, an older human with gray coloring at the sides of his head and visible scars on his hands. And he said nothing during the diplomatic exchange, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every person in the room, every entrance and exit, every potential threat. The council debated for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt because they were desperate. They had no other options. And even if these strange soft creatures were walking into a slaughter, at least they would buy time for evacuation efforts. Krelvax was assigned as liaison officer to the human vessel called the Resolute, commanded by a male named Captain Nathan Shaw. And this assignment was supposed to be simple: just observe and report. Assess the capabilities of these new allies and determine if they could be useful in any meaningful way. Captain Shaw was a stocky human with a shaved head and eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, and he welcomed Krelvax aboard with a firm grip of his hand. A human greeting that Krelvax had been briefed on but still found uncomfortable. Glad to have you with us, Shaw said. And his voice was steady and calm. I hope you will find our ship adequate for your needs. We are not as elegant as your Valkyrie vessels, but we get the job done. The Resolute was indeed nothing like a Valkyrie warship, where Krelvax's people valued sleek designs and efficient systems. The humans seemed to embrace redundancy and durability above all else, with backup systems for every critical function, emergency equipment lining every corridor, and weapons lockers placed every 20 meters throughout the ship. Shaw gave Krelvax a tour personally, pointing out the various features of the vessel with obvious pride. We build our ships to take punishment, the captain explained. The philosophy is simple. If something can break, then assume it will break at the worst possible moment, and plan accordingly. Krelvax noticed that the crew moved with a strange energy. Not the disciplined precision of Valkyrie military personnel, but something more chaotic, more passionate. They joked with each other while performing maintenance. They argued loudly over tactical decisions. They displayed emotions openly in ways that would have been considered unprofessional on any coalition. Vessel, a young female officer named Katie Reyes, served at the tactical station. Barely into adulthood by human standards, and yet she carried herself with the confidence of a veteran. Her fingers dancing across her console as she ran combat simulations over and over again. Do your people always assign such young officers to critical positions? Krelvax asked Captain Shaw. The captain looked at Rise, and something soft in his expression, something that looked almost like affection. She earned that position, he said. Age matters less than ability among our people, and Katie has more ability than officers twice her age. She will be commanding her own ship within a decade, if I have anything to say about it. 3 days after Krelvax came aboard, the first engagement with the Scarith occurred. A patrol fleet intercepted the combined task force near the mining colonies of Verith Prime, and everything Krelvax thought he understood about warfare changed forever. The VD enemy moved into their standard attack formation, a pattern Krelvax had seen hundreds of times. Close to optimal range, release boarding pods, overwhelm the defenders with superior numbers. It had worked against every species in the coalition. Captain Shaw stood at the center of the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice never rising above conversational volume as he gave orders. Helm, bring us to heading 270 weapons. I want firing solutions on the 3 lead vessels. Launch when ready. The Resolute did not wait for optimal range. The humans opened fire at extreme distance, their kinetic weapons accelerating solid projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed. And the first Scarith cruiser simply ceased to exist. Its hull punctured in a dozen places before the crew could even react. Krelvax watched in stunned silence as the human vessel charged forward into the enemy formation, taking hits that would have sent any Valkyrie captain into immediate retreat. The ship shuddering with impacts, damage reports streaming across the displays. And still Shaw did not order withdrawal. Damage control teams to sections 5 through 8, he said calmly. Seal those breaches and get our portside batteries back online. The Scarith had never faced an enemy that refused to retreat when damaged. They had never encountered a species that would absorb casualties and keep advancing. And when the second wave of human ships arrived, the enemy formation began to waver for the first time in 30 cycles. The Scarith retreated from a battle they had not won. Krelvax stood in the damaged bridge, surrounded by exhausted humans who were already beginning repairs. And he felt something he had not experienced since the war began: hope. Joining humans in war showed me what true terror means. The weeks following the battle at Verith Prime were unlike anything Krelvax had experienced in his entire military career, and he found himself constantly observing the humans around him, trying to understand what made them so different from every other species he had encountered. The Resolute had taken significant damage during the engagement, but the crew repaired it with a speed that seemed almost impossible, working through sleep cycles, ignoring injuries that would have sent Velthari soldiers to medical facilities, pushing themselves beyond what Krulvax had believed organic beings could endure. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb was responsible for the ship's weapon systems, a large male with heavily muscled arms and a voice that could carry across the entire engineering deck. And Krulvax had watched him dismantle a malfunctioning torpedo launcher with his bare hands. When the equipment failed during the battle, the same male spent his off-duty hours tending to a small collection of plants in his quarters, flowering varieties from Earth that served no practical purpose. And when Krulvax asked about this contradiction, Webb had smiled in a way that transformed his intimidating features into something almost gentle. "These remind me of home," Webb explained. "My grandmother had a garden just like this. Used to spend hours there as a kid. Helps me remember what we were fighting for." Krulvax did not fully understand, but he filed the information away. Another piece of the puzzle that was humanity Lieutenant Commander Grace Okonkwo served as the ship's medical officer. A soft-spoken female with precise movements and careful attention to detail. And during combat she worked with mechanical efficiency, treating wounded crew and performing emergency surgery while the ship shook around her. After the battle, a Scarth soldier had been captured when his boarding pod was disabled before reaching its target. The enemy was dying, his injuries too severe for his own physiology to repair. And Krulvax expected the humans to simply let him die or perhaps accelerate the process instead. Okonkwo worked on him for 3 hours. She used every technique available to her, adapted human medical procedures for alien biology, consulted with coalition medical databases, and fought to save the life of a creature whose species had killed billions of innocent beings. "Why are you doing this?" Krulvax finally asked. Unable to contain his confusion, "He is the enemy. His people have destroyed entire worlds." The doctor looked at him with an expression he could not interpret. Something between sadness and determination. "Because I took an oath to preserve life," she said, "and because he was in pain. I cannot simply watch a thinking being suffer when I have the ability to help." The Scarth prisoner died despite her efforts, his body too damaged to survive, even with the best care. And Okonkwo recorded the time of death in her medical logs with a face that betrayed no emotion. But later that night, Krulvax found her alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars with tears running down her face. And he understood then that the humans did not lack feelings. They simply controlled them when duty required, and released them only when they were alone. The contradictions kept mounting. Captain Shaw conducted tactical briefings with cold efficiency, discussing casualty projections and acceptable losses with the detachment of someone discussing weather patterns. And yet Krulvax observed him spending hours writing personal letters to the families of crew members who had died in battle. Katie Reyes could calculate firing solutions that destroyed enemy vessels with devastating precision, her young face showing no hesitation as she triggered weapons that killed thousands. And the same female spent her free time teaching other crew members to play a musical instrument called a guitar, her fingers creating sounds that were somehow both joyful and melancholy. The humans could kill without hesitation and grieve, without shame. They could be ruthless in battle and tender in private moments. They were capable of both great cruelty and profound compassion. And sometimes these opposing qualities appeared within the same heartbeat. Relvavs began to notice something else as well. The way other species in the coalition reacted to the humans had started to change. The Velthari had initially viewed them as curiosities, primitive creatures with crude technology who would likely be destroyed in their first serious engagement. But after Varath Prime, the attitude shifted to cautious respect. The Kathrani, a species of reptilian warriors who had been fighting the Scarth for even longer than the Velthari, began requesting joint operations with human vessels. their commanders recognizing something in the humans that resonated with their own warrior traditions. Even the Scarith themselves seemed to be adapting their strategies. Krelvax noticed that enemy patrols had begun avoiding sectors where human ships were operating, choosing instead to engage coalition forces that did not include the strange newcomers. He brought this observation to Captain Shaw during one of their regular briefings. The enemy appears to be specifically avoiding contact with human vessels. Krelvax reported, their patrol patterns have shifted significantly since the battle at Varith Prime. Shaw nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Let them be afraid. Fear is a weapon, and we intend to use it. But surely they will adapt eventually. The Scarith are not unintelligent. They will develop counters to your tactics. Maybe, Shaw acknowledged, but adaptation takes time. And every day they spend figuring out how to fight us is a day they are not conquering new worlds. We call it buying time with blood. Not the most elegant strategy, but effective. The phrase stuck with Krelvax, buying time with blood. It encapsulated something essential about human warfare that he was only beginning to understand. The Velthari fought to preserve their civilization, retreating when the cost became too high, accepting losses only when absolutely necessary. Their strategy was built around survival and the long-term continuation of their species. The humans fought differently. They seemed willing to sacrifice themselves not just for survival, but for abstract concepts. Things like honor and justice and freedom. Ideas that had no material value but which the humans treated as more important than their own lives. A week after Varith Prime, the Coalition launched a major offensive to reclaim a cluster of mining stations that had been captured by the Scarith. The operation required a force to hold a critical jump point while the main fleet maneuvered into position. And everyone knew that the holding force would take heavy casualties. Captain Shaw volunteered the Resolute without hesitation. We will hold that point, he said, during the planning session. Whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. The Velthari admiral commanding the operation seemed surprised by this willingness to accept what might be a suicide mission. You understand the risks. Captain, your ship may be destroyed, your crew killed to the last being. Shaw's expression did not change. We understand. Admiral, but someone has to hold that line. And my people are good at holding lines. Krelvax wanted to object. Wanted to point out that the Resolute was one of the most effective human vessels in the fleet, and sacrificing it for a single operation made no strategic sense. But he held his tongue because he was beginning to understand that human decision-making operated on principles. He did not fully grasp the battle at the jump point lasted 6 hours. The Resolute and 3 other human vessels facing a Scarith force that outnumbered them 5-1. And Krelvax watched from the bridge as the humans fought with a ferocity that defied explanation. They did not retreat when their shields failed. They did not surrender when their weapons went offline. They used the ship itself as a weapon, ramming enemy vessels when all other options were exhausted, and somehow, impossibly, they held when the main coalition fleet arrived to relieve them. The Resolute was barely functional. Nearly half its crew dead or wounded, its hull breached in a dozen places. But the jump point was secure, and the enemy had been stopped. Captain Shaw stood in the wreckage of his bridge, blood running from a wound on his forehead. And he smiled. Mission accomplished, he said simply. And then he collapsed from exhaustion. Krells caught him before he hit the deck. This strange human, who had just sacrificed everything for a strategic objective. And he understood in that moment that the Scarith were right to be afraid. These humans were something new in the galaxy, something that did not follow the rules that every other species had accepted. And whatever came next, Krelvax knew that he wanted to be there to witness it. Joining humans in war showed me what true terror means. The months that followed the battle at the jump point brought more victories and more revelations. And Krelvax found himself becoming something he had never expected to become. Not just an observer of human behavior, but something approaching a participant in their strange culture. Resolute had been repaired and returned to active duty with a crew that was half new replacements. Young humans who had volunteered to serve on a ship that had become famous throughout the coalition. And Krelvax watched these newcomers integrate with the veterans, learning the unwritten rules and traditions that made human military units function. One of the new arrivals was a young male named Danny Porter, barely past the age of physical maturity, with nervous energy that made him fidget constantly and eyes that were always wide with either excitement or fear. Porter had been assigned to the engineering section under Chief Webb, and Krelvax observed their interactions with growing fascination. "You are going to get yourself killed if you keep working like that," Webb told the young male after a particularly dangerous repair operation. "Slow down. Think before you act. We need you alive." Porter looked confused, almost hurt by the criticism, but I thought speed was important. Get the job done fast. That is what they taught us in training. Webb shook his head and placed one of his large hands on the younger human's shoulder. Speed matters in combat. But right now we are not in combat. Right now we are preparing for combat. And preparation means doing things correctly, not quickly. A rushed repair can fail at the worst possible moment, and then everyone dies. Do you understand? Porter nodded slowly, and something in his posture changed. The nervous energy focusing into something more controlled. Relklax asked Webb about the interaction later, curious about the relationship between senior and junior personnel. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Webb admitted. "All energy and no direction. Someone took the time to teach me how to channel that energy properly. Now I do the same for others. It is how we continue, how we pass on what we have learned." The concept of mentorship was not unique to humans. The Velthari had similar traditions, but there was something different about how the humans practiced it. A personal investment that went beyond professional obligation. Webb did not just teach Porter how to do his job. He taught him how to survive, how to think, how to become the kind of person who could handle the pressures of combat. And Krelvax realized that this was happening throughout the ship. Older humans guiding younger ones, creating bonds that transcended rank and duty. The Resolute received orders to participate in a major offensive, a coordinated strike against a Skara supply convoy that was carrying resources to reinforce their frontline positions. And the operation would involve ships from every species in the coalition. Working together for the first time, Admiral Patricia Cole commanded the human contingent from her flagship, the Defiance, a larger vessel than the Resolute, but built with the same philosophy of redundancy and durability. And she convened a planning session that included representatives from all participating. Specious Krelvax attended as the Velthari liaison, standing among officers from a dozen different worlds, watching as the humans laid out their proposed strategy. The convoy will be escorted by a substantial defensive force, Admiral Cole explained, her voice calm and clear. Our scouts estimate at least 30 combat vessels, plus the transport ships themselves. A direct assault would be costly. A Kethrani commander made a rumbling sound of agreement, his reptilian features difficult to read, but his body language suggesting respect. "What do you propose?" "Admiral, we propose dividing our forces into 3 groups. The first group will engage the escorts directly, drawing their attention and fixing them in place. The second group will loop around and strike the transports from the opposite direction. The third group will remain in reserve to exploit any opportunities that develop." The plan was sound but not revolutionary. Standard coalition tactics adapted for the specific circumstances. What made it different was the human willingness to lead the most dangerous elements. The Defiance will command the first group. Cole continued, "We will take the initial contact with the enemy escorts." The room went quiet because everyone understood what that meant. The first group would face the full strength of the Scarith defenders. They would take the heaviest casualties. They would be buying time and opportunity with their own blood. A Velthari admiral named Korvax spoke up, his translator rendering his words carefully. You are volunteering to accept the greatest risk. Admiral, why? Cole looked at him steadily, her expression showing nothing but calm determination. Because we can take it. Admiral, human vessels are built to absorb punishment. Our crews are trained to fight through damage that would cripple other ships. We are the logical choice for the most dangerous assignment. There was something in her tone that Krelvax was beginning to recognize. Not arrogance, but confidence. The quiet certainty of someone who had faced death many times and had learned not to fear it. The operation launched 3 days later, and Krelvax watched from the bridge of the Resolute as the plan unfolded. First group engaged the Scarith escorts exactly as predicted. A brutal exchange of fire that lit up the darkness between stars. Human ships taking hit after hit while their weapons tore into enemy formations. And the defenders were so focused on this threat that they failed to notice the second group approaching from behind. The transports were destroyed in minutes. Their cargo of weapons and supplies scattered across the void. And the Scarith escorts found themselves trapped between two hostile forces with nowhere to retreat. But victory came with a price. The Defiance was crippled, its engines destroyed, its hull breached in multiple locations. And Admiral Cole was among the wounded. A piece of shrapnel having torn through her command station, Captain Shaw took command of the remaining human vessels. His voice steady despite the chaos. All ships, press the attack. Do not let them regroup. Medical teams to the Defiance. Get our people out of there. Krelvax watched as human shuttles launched toward the stricken flagship. Crews risking their lives to rescue their comrades, even as the battle continued around them. And he understood that this was not just strategy. This was something deeper. A refusal to abandon their own regardless of the cost. The Scarith escorts were destroyed to the last ship, their formation broken by the coordinated assault. And when the silence finally settled over the battlefield, Krelvax counted the losses. 3 human vessels destroyed, 2 more heavily damaged. Over 200 humans dead, but the convoy was gone. The enemy supply lines were severed, and the strategic objective had been achieved. Admiral Cole survived her injuries, though she would carry scars for the rest of her life. And when she addressed the fleet from her hospital bed, her words carried a weight that Krelvax had come to associate with human leadership. We paid a heavy price today, she said, her voice rough but steady, and we will pay more before this war is over. But every sacrifice brings us closer to victory. Every loss weakens our enemy. Every battle teaches us something new. We fight not because we want to die, but because some things are worth dying for. Krelvax thought about those words for a long time afterward, trying to understand what they meant. What could possibly be worth the kind of sacrifice he had witnessed? He asked Captain Shaw about it during a quiet moment after the battle. What is it that makes your people willing to die for this cause? You have no history with the Scarith, no ancient grudge, no personal stake in this conflict. Why do you fight so hard? Shaw was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something distant. We fight because it is right, he said finally. We fight because innocent people are suffering, and we have the power to help them. We fight because if we do not, who will? At the cost, Krelvax pressed. The lives lost, the families destroyed. How do you justify such sacrifice? Shaw turned to look at him directly, and there was something in his eyes that Krelvax had never seen before. A depth of emotion that seemed almost painful. We do not justify it, Shaw admitted. We accept it, we mourn it, we carry it with us forever. Every person who dies under my command is a weight I will bear until my own death. But I bear it because the alternative is worse. Because doing nothing when you have the power to act is its own kind of evil. Krelvax did not fully understand. Perhaps he never would. But he was beginning to see why the Scarith were afraid of these strange creatures from a distant world. The humans were not just dangerous because of their technology or their tactics. They were dangerous because they believed in something that could not be measured or calculated, something that made them willing to sacrifice everything for people they had never met. That kind of conviction was terrifying to face in battle, and Krelvax was increasingly glad that the humans were on his side. Joining humans in war showed me what true terror means. The turning point of the war came at a place called Kethra Station, a massive orbital facility that served as the primary staging ground for all Scarith operations in the sector. And intelligence suggested that destroying it would cripple enemy logistics for months, perhaps long enough to turn the entire tide of the conflict. The coalition committed everything they had remaining. Over 200 vessels from a dozen species gathered for what everyone understood would be the decisive battle: victory or defeat, survival or extinction. And Krelvax stood on the bridge of the Resolute, watching the fleet assemble with a mixture of hope and dread. The human contingent formed the vanguard as usual, their blocky angular ships, looking almost primitive compared to the elegant designs of the Valkyrie or the sleek predatory lines of the Kathrani vessels. But Krelvax had learned not to judge by appearances. The Scarith had fortified their position with everything they had. 3 defensive rings of weapons platforms surrounded the station, each ring bristling with enough firepower to destroy a fleet. And a garrison of over 50,000 soldiers waited inside. Ready to repel any boarding action, Admiral Cole had recovered enough to resume command, though she still moved carefully, and her voice carried a rasp that had not been there before. And she addressed the combined fleet before the assault. "This will not be easy," she said, her words carrying to every ship through the communication network. "Many of us will not survive. But if we succeed here today, we will have broken the back of the Scaroth war machine. Our children and grandchildren will live in a galaxy free from their threat. That is what we are fighting for. That is what we are dying for." The initial assault was catastrophic. Coalition ships were destroyed by the dozens as they pressed forward against the defensive rings. The Valkyrie flagship was crippled in the first hour of fighting, its graceful hull torn apart by concentrated fire. And Krelvax watched the tactical displays as vessel after vessel went dark, their crews either dead or dying in the cold void. The human ships pushed forward regardless, absorbing punishment that would have sent any other force into retreat, their kinetic weapons hammering at the defensive platforms while their point defense systems worked overtime to intercept incoming fire. Captain Shaw stood at the center of the bridge, his voice calm despite the chaos around him, issuing orders with the same steady efficiency he had shown in every battle. "Helm, adjust heading to 245, weapons. Concentrate fire on platform 17. I want that gun battery silenced." Katie Reyes worked her tactical station with focused intensity, her fingers dancing across the controls as she coordinated the ship's weapon systems. "Platform 17 destroyed, Captain, but we are taking heavy fire from platform 22. Understood. Damage control teams to section 12. Seal those breaches." The Resolute shuddered with another impact, and somewhere in the ship something exploded, the sound muffled by distance, but still audible on the bridge. And Krelvax gripped his station tightly as the artificial gravity fluctuated for a terrifying moment. Admiral Cole ordered the fleet to regroup, to reassess the situation. The first defensive ring had been breached, but the cost was staggering. Over 40 ships lost, thousands of crew dead, and 2 more rings still stood between them and the station. The obvious choice was retreat. Pull back, preserve what remained, and try again another day with better preparation. It was what the Valkyrie would have done, what any sensible military commander would have recommended. The humans had a different idea, Captain. Shaw convened a meeting of all human commanding officers via secure communication. And Krelvax was not invited, but he found a way to monitor the conversation through the ship's internal systems. What he witnessed would stay with him for the rest of his life. The humans did not argue for retreat. They did not debate the mathematics of victory versus defeat. Instead, they discussed how to ensure the mission succeeded regardless of cost. Commander Benjamin Hayes of the destroyer Tempest volunteered his ship to draw fire from the primary defense batteries. A suicide mission that would require flying directly into the heaviest concentration of enemy weapons. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Price offered a plan to breach the second defensive ring using concentrated nuclear weapons. Accepting that the radiation would contaminate nearby friendly vessels, a young captain named Maria Santos suggested something that made Krelvax feel cold inside. If we can get Marines aboard the station itself, we can take out their command and control from the inside. The defenses will lose coordination. They will become vulnerable. Admiral Cole studied the tactical projections for a long moment before responding. The boarding action would be one way. We do not have the resources to extract anyone from inside that station. Whoever goes in will not be coming back. Captain Shaw spoke up without hesitation. I will lead the ground team personally. There was no debate. No argument, no attempt to find another way. The humans simply accepted that some of them would die to give the others a chance at victory. The second phase of the battle was even more brutal than the first. The Tempest flew straight into the heart of the enemy defenses. Commander Hayes broadcasting a final message to the fleet as his ship was torn apart by concentrated fire. Give them hell. For us, were his last words before the transmission cut off. The nuclear bombardment created a gap in the second defensive ring, just as Price had predicted. Though 3 coalition vessels were disabled by the resulting radiation and had to be evacuated, and the assault force pushed through the opening with everything they had left, a third ring fell more quickly. The Scarus defenders finally began to waver as they realized that these enemies would not stop, could not be deterred by casualties that would have broken any other force. And the station itself lay expatriated. Relvams watched as the boarding shuttles launched. Captain Shaw leading 30 Marines in a desperate assault on a facility defended by 50,000 enemy soldiers. And he wanted to say something, wanted to express the strange mixture of admiration and horror that filled him. But there were no words adequate to the moment. The fighting inside Kethra Station lasted for hours. Krelvax monitoring the fragmented communications as the human Marines advanced through corridors filled with enemy troops, taking casualties at every turn, but never stopping, never retreating, never surrendering. Sergeant Major Tony Russo held a critical junction for 20 minutes with nothing but a damaged rifle and a combat knife. His ammunition exhausted, but his determination unbroken. And he killed 17 Scarith soldiers before his wounds finally took him. Corporal Diana Cruz carried 2 wounded comrades through 3 kilometers of enemy territory, refusing to leave them behind, even as her own injuries made every step agony. And she collapsed only after reaching a defensible position where medics could take over. The Marines reached the command center with only 4 of the original 30 still able to fight, Captain Shaw among them, and they detonated charges that crippled the station's defensive coordination. The effect was immediate. The remaining weapons platforms lost their synchronized targeting, their fire becoming scattered and ineffective. And the coalition fleet surged forward to deliver the killing blow. Shaw and his surviving Marines held their position for another hour, fighting off wave after wave of Scarith counterattacks, buying time for the external assault to succeed. And when rescue teams finally breached the station, only 2 humans were still alive. Captain Shaw had taken wounds that would have killed most beings. His body armor shattered, his left arm hanging useless at his side. But he was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give up. The young private who survived with him was named Samuel Young, barely 20 years old. And he had to be physically restrained by the rescue team because he wanted to keep fighting even after the battle. Was one Cathara station fell. The Scarith fleet scattered. The war shifted from desperate defense to coordinated offense, and the coalition had achieved a victory that had seemed impossible just days before. The cost was measured in thousands of human lives. Kralvax stood in the ruins of the station's command center, surrounded by the bodies of friends and enemies alike. And he understood finally what made the humans so terrifying. They were not fearless. He could see the fear in their eyes every time they went into battle. But they fought anyway, they sacrificed anyway, they died anyway. Because they believed that some things were more important than survival. That kind of conviction could not be reasoned with, could not be predicted, could not be defeated by superior numbers or better technology. The Scarith had finally met an enemy they could not understand, and that enemy had broken them. Joining humans in war showed me what true terror means. The war ended 14 months after the fall of Kethra Station. The Scarith High Command surrendering unconditionally after their forces had been pushed back to their home system. Their fleets dismantled, their capacity for aggression permanently reduced, and the galaxy entered a period of peace that few had believed possible. Rivavs attended the victory celebration aboard the newly commissioned flagship of the United Earth Fleet, a massive vessel named the Remember, a tribute to all those who had fallen during the long conflict. And he moved through crowds of celebrating beings from a dozen different species. Searching for one particular human, he found Captain Shaw standing alone on an observation deck, watching the gathered fleet through reinforced glass. His reflection ghost-like against the backdrop of stars and ship. Shaw had aged visibly since Kethra. His movements slower, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. And the wounds he had suffered during the boarding action had left scars that no medical technology could fully erase. "You seem troubled for a victory celebration," Krelvax observed. Moving to stand beside him, Shaw was quiet for a long moment before responding, his eyes never leaving the view outside. "Do you know why we fight the way we do?" he asked finally. "I have developed theories over the past 2 years. None of them satisfy me completely." The human turned to face him, and Krelvax saw something in his eyes that he had never noticed before. Beneath the determination and the resolve, there was exhaustion, a weariness that ran deeper than physical fatigue, that reached into the very core of his being. "We are afraid," Shaw said. Simply. Krelvax could not hide his confusion, his translator struggling to convey the expression on his face. "You showed no fear in battle. Your species advances into death without hesitation. I have seen humans laugh while their ships burned around them. I have seen them sing while walking towards certain destruction. That is exactly what I mean." Shaw looked back at the stars, his voice dropping lower. "We are terrified of what we might become if we stop fighting. Terrified of losing the people we care about. Terrified of a universe where evil wins because good people were not willing to sacrifice enough to stop it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Every human soldier knows they might die. They accept that possibility before they ever set foot on a ship. But what really drives us? What makes us charge into impossible odds and refuse to surrender even when logic demands it? Is that we are more afraid of failing than we are of dying. Krelvax considered this for a long time, thinking about all the contradictions he had observed. The garden in Marcus Webb's quarters, Grace Okonkwo crying alone after failing to save an enemy, Maria Santos volunteering for a mission she knew she would not survive. "I believed I understood fear before I met your kind," he finally said. "The Scarith terrified us because of their cruelty, their overwhelming force, their willingness to destroy everything in their path. We feared them the way prey fears predators, as a natural response to an obvious threat. And now," Shaw asked. Krelvax chose his words carefully, wanting to express something that had taken him years to understand. Now I realized that the Scarith were merely dangerous. They were predators following instincts that could be predicted and eventually countered. Their behavior made sense within the framework of conquest and survival. They wanted resources and territory and power, all things that could be measured and understood. He turned to look at Shaw directly. Your species is something else entirely. You love deeply and hate fiercely. You build beautiful things and destroy them with equal passion. You show mercy to enemies who deserve none and demand justice from allies who have done nothing wrong. You are capable of becoming anything the situation requires, even if it costs you everything, even if it breaks you. Shaw smiled, though his eyes remained tired. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It is the truth. And the truth is rarely comfortable. The Scarith conquered because they were strong, because they were willing to do terrible things to achieve their goals, but their strength was predictable. Their terrible acts followed patterns that could be anticipated. Krulvax looked out at the celebrating fleet, and the vessels crewed by humans and aliens united in victory. Humans win because you are unpredictable, because you make choices that no rational calculation would support, because you will sacrifice everything for abstractions you cannot even clearly define. Honor and justice and freedom and love, these are not things that can be weighed or measured. They are not resources that can be captured or territories that can be controlled. He turned back to Shaw. Joining humans in war showed me what true terror means. It means facing an enemy who will not stop, who cannot be reasoned with, who will sacrifice everything for principles that exist only in their minds. It means fighting beings who are afraid, deeply afraid, and who channel that fear into absolute determination rather than retreat. Shaw was silent, listening. The Scarith were monsters, Krulvax continued. But monsters can be defeated by understanding their nature, by predicting their behavior, by exploiting their weaknesses. Humans are something far more frightening. You are driven by emotions that even you do not fully understand. You make decisions that even you cannot explain, and you will never, ever give up. Is that why you stayed? Shaw asked after a long moment. Why you kept serving with us even after you had enough observations for 100 reports? You could have returned to your own people months ago. Krulvax considered the question honestly, thinking about all the reasons he had given himself, all the justifications and explanations that had seemed adequate at the time. I stayed because I wanted to believe that such determination could be real. He admitted that there existed a species willing to sacrifice everything for principles that had no material value. The galaxy has needed such a species for a very long time. We've been waiting for someone to show us that courage is possible, that conviction can triumph over calculation. He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. And I stayed because despite everything I have seen, despite the blood and the death and the terrible cost, I have come to believe that humans are worth fighting alongside. Your fear drives you to terrible acts, but it also drives you to extraordinary ones. The same fire that makes you dangerous also makes you beautiful. The same passion that leads you to violence also leads you to compassion. Shaw said nothing, but his shoulders seemed to straighten slightly, some of the weight lifting from his posture. I will be returning to Vulthury space soon, Krulvax continued. My government wants a full report on human military capabilities. They want to understand what makes you effective so they can incorporate those lessons into our own forces. And what will you tell them? Krulvax thought about the garden and the tears and the songs sung in the face of death. He thought about young Danny Porter learning to control his energy and old Marcus Webb teaching him patience. He thought about Admiral Cole leading from the front and Captain Shaw volunteering for suicide missions without hesitation. I will tell them that human effectiveness cannot be replicated through training or technology. I will tell them that what makes you powerful is something that grows from the inside, something that cannot be manufactured or imposed. I will tell them that the secret to human warfare is not weapons or tactics, but belief. Belief that some things are worth dying for. Belief that individual sacrifice can change the universe. Belief that fear should be channeled into determination rather than surrender. He paused. I do not know if they will understand. I am not certain I understand myself, but I will try to explain what I have witnessed. I will try to convey what it means to fight alongside humans. Shaw reached out and gripped Krelvak's arm. A human gesture of connection that had once felt awkward, but now felt natural. Thank you, he said. For everything, for staying with us, for fighting with us, for trying to understand us. They stood together in silence. Watching the stars, somewhere out there new threats were surely gathering. New wars would come. New enemies would rise. New sacrifices would be demanded. The universe was vast and filled with dangers that no one could predict. But for this moment, there was peace. And Krelvax, liaison officer of the Velfari Collective, found himself grateful that when the next darkness came, humanity would be standing beside his people to face Ide had learned what true terror meant, and he had learned that sometimes the most terrifying beings in the universe could also be the most noble. There was the paradox of humanity, the contradiction that made them unique among all the species of the galaxy. They were afraid, and their fear made them unstoppable. They were dangerous, and their danger made them beautiful. They were human, and Krelvax was honored to have known them.